Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So, I was discussing about the territorial principle in part 1 of my video lecture, and this is part 2 of my video lecture on state jurisdictions. So, this territorial principle, it has been accepted by all states of the world, meaning that it received universal jurisdiction. No state in the world object to this principle, and it is also the strongest ground for claiming jurisdiction. It is the strongest ground for claiming jurisdiction. Out of the 5 general principles of claiming criminal jurisdiction, territorial principle is the strongest ground for claiming jurisdiction. Why? Because there are practical advantages of this territorial principle. Number 1, the convenience of the forum. In Latin we call forum convenient. Forum convenient. The forum, the court, is if a crime was committed in Malaysia, and the Malaysian court is the most appropriate court to decide this crime. So the court in Malaysia is the most appropriate court to decide the case. This is number 1. Number 2, involvement of the interest of the state where the crime is committed. The interest of the state is involved. A crime is committed in Malaysia, then Malaysia as well as all the Malaysians are interested in the crime. So that's this involvement of interest of the state. And number 3, all the witnesses, all the evidence, physical evidence, everything which can be found in the territorial states. So that's why territorial principle has practical advantages. And this is the strongest ground for claiming jurisdiction and universally recognized and accepted. Now, extension of the territorial principle. In the modern time, because of the development of interstate transactions and because of the globalization, so the territorial principle has been accepted to be extended. Okay, so to be extended, whenever a crime is committed in whole or in part within its territory, not necessarily to be in whole, but even when the crime is committed in part within the territory of a state, that state can claim on the basis of territorial principle. This is the extension of the concept of territorial principle. When a crime is committed in part, when an essential constituent element is consummated in that country, then we can see that crime is committed in part in that country. An essential constituent element. You know that there are elements of a crime, right? An essential constituent element of the crime is committed in a particular state. In Malaysia, for example, Malaysia can claim on the basis of territorial principle, not necessarily the whole of the crime to be committed in Malaysia. Okay, so that's why, because of this modern development, the territorial principle is extended, and we now accept that there are 2 kinds of territorial principle: subjective territorial principle and objective territorial principle. Okay, what are the 2 territorial principles? Number 1, subjective territorial principle. Subjective. The meaning is a state has jurisdiction when an essential constituent element of a crime commenced in its country, but completed or consummated in a foreign country, in a foreign country abroad. So this is that state where the crime commenced can claim on the basis of territorial principle. If a crime commenced in Malaysia and completed in Thailand, the Malaysia can claim on the basis of subjective territorial principle. Why? Because the crime commenced in Malaysia. Okay, so that's why subjective territorial principle, always remember where the crime commenced. Where the crime commenced, the state where the crime commenced can claim on the basis of subjective territorial principle. And then second one, objective territorial principle. A state has jurisdiction when an essential constituent element of a crime is commenced in another state but completed or consummated in its territory, mean in Malaysia, for example. Completed in Malaysia, then Malaysia can claim on the basis of objective territorial principle. So that's why objective territorial principle is completion of the crime. Completion of the crime. Subjective territorial principle is the commencement of the crime. The country where the crime commenced, subjective. The country where the crime completed, objective. So I will give you very practical example. For example, a Thai national from Thailand side of the territory fire a gunshot, and that it's near the border to Malaysia, and then the gunshot, a Malaysian in the Malaysian territory was killed by this gunshot. Now the gunshot comes from Thailand territory. The gun was fired from Thailand territory, but the gunshot hit, the bullet hit a Malaysian which is within the Malaysian territory. So now Thailand and Malaysia, which country can claim jurisdiction? On the part of Thailand, the crime commenced in Thailand because the gunshot started from Thailand. So that's why Thailand can claim on the basis of subjective territorial principle, and Malaysia, whether the gunshot hit a Malaysian, the crime completed in Malaysia. A Malaysian was killed in the Malaysian territory. That's why the completion of crime is in Malaysia. Malaysia can claim on the basis of objective territorial principle. And of the two principles, if we compare the two principles, so many writers believe that objective territorial is stronger ground than the subjective territorial principle if we compare the two countries. Okay. Now, the leading case for this objective territorial principle is the famous Lotus case. Lotus case. So we refer many times the Lotus case. Now you can see the facts of the Lotus case here in this under this topic. So this is the collision case. Collision occurred on the high seas. Collision means colliding of the two vessels. The two vessels collided like car accident. The ship also can collide each other. This is called collision. So the case was a collision case have occurred on the high seas between a French steamer, the Lotus. Lotus is a French steamer, French ship, and a Turkish steamer, Turkish ship. And then the Turkish ship was sunk. And then the 8 Turkish sailors were killed, died. So the collision started from the Lotus, the French ship. The French ship collided the Turkish vessel, and the Turkish vessel was sunk, and 8 Turkish sailors were killed. So later on, when the Lotus, the French ship, entered a Turkish port, so Turkish authorities arrested the French officer in charge of this vessel, and then arrested on the criminal charge of manslaughter. But France objected to the Turkish exercise of jurisdiction over its national because they argued that he is French national and the crime occurred where? The crime occurred on the high seas. And in public international law, second part, you have to study about the law of the sea, international law of the sea. The high seas are free. So there is freedom of the high seas. Every ship, all ships can sail freely on the high seas. And no states can exercise jurisdiction apart from the flag state. Only the flag state. If the French ship, only France, which is the flag state, has exclusive jurisdiction. That's the Lotus case laid down this principle of the exclusive jurisdiction of the flag state on the high seas. So that's why Turkey has no jurisdiction. They argue like that. However, the PCIJ, Permanent Court of International Justice, decided that the Turkish vessel was to be assimilated to Turkish territory. Now, this part of the judgment is the old law, old international law. So according to the old international law in the past, like 16th, 17th, 18th century, there was a theory known as floating island theory. So according to this theory, a ship is assimilated to an island of a state. An island of the state is floating on the seas. So that's an Malaysian vessel. For the Malaysian vessel is a Malaysian island, Malaysian territory, which is floating on the sea. This is a floating island theory. So now the court applied this old international law theory of floating island theory, but in modern international law, according to the current international law of the sea convention UNCLOS, this theory is no longer accepted. So this part of the law has already been revised and no longer valid. So this is a floating island theory. So the Turkish vessel is assimilated to Turkish territory. So that's why the crime commenced from the French territory, the French ship, the French vessel. French vessel collided the Turkish vessel. The crime commenced in the French territory, but finally the crime completed because the French vessel hit the Turkish vessel, and the Turkish vessel was sunk, and 8 sailors, Turkish sailors, were killed. So that's why the crime completed in the Turkish territory. So that's why by applying the principle of objective territorial principle, where the crime completed, within which territory the crime completed. Here in this case, the crime completed in the Turkish territory, which is the Turkish vessel. Okay, so that's why Turkey was entitled to exercise jurisdiction because a constituent element in the offense of manslaughter, that is death, had occurred on Turkish territory. Death has occurred on Turkish territory, and it is the completion of the crime. So that's why the Turkey can claim jurisdiction on the basis of objective territorial principle. Okay, this is the acceptance of objective territorial principle by the International Permanent Court of International Justice. Now, another point is we can apply this objective territorial principle in conspiracy cases. Because conspiracy is something like so first the two parties agree to conspire first. This agreement to conspire may be made in a foreign country, and this implementation of this conspiracy can be contracted in the territory of another state. So that's why, so there can 2 states may be involved. So the leading case on this point is DPP versus Dutt, decided by House of Lords. So in this case, the respondents were foreigners, and they were convicted of conspiracy to import cannabis. Cannabis means drugs. To import cannabis into the UK. So the agreement amounting to the conspiracy had been made abroad in a foreign country. Later on, they were arrested in England while in the course of carrying out this conspiracy. So that's why the House of Lords held. The English courts had jurisdiction because the offense, conspiracy, completed or consummated in England while steps were being taken in concert there to carry out the purpose of the conspiracy. So the crime of the offense or conspiracy completed in England. So that's why England can claim on the basis of objective territorial principle where the crime was completed. So this also application of objective territorial principle in the case of conspiracy. Okay, that's the next principle. The second principle is nationality principle. So international law permits a state to exercise jurisdiction over its nationals. Okay, the linkage is nationality. If a Malaysian national committed a crime, international law allows Malaysia to exercise jurisdiction because he is a Malaysian national. Even though he committed a crime anywhere in the world, even though he committed a crime in England or in US or wherever in the world. So there's a nationality principle. On the basis of nationality, a state can claim jurisdiction. A Malaysian commit a crime if we apply nationality principle. Even on the moon, a Malaysian commits a crime, then Malaysia can claim jurisdiction. Okay. But of course, the national must come within the territory of the state. He must come back to Malaysia with the custody of him. The custody is important. Otherwise, the enforcement will not be effective. I will proceed this in the next part. Thank you.